Late summer and early fall gardens should be in full swing by now. There's a lot that can be done in the garden right now to get ready for fall planting to extend the growing season and harvest. We've just returned to our Zone 8 Southern Utah garden after 10 days, and it's become very apparent of the things that need to be done. This time of year, many of my plants have become overgrown and need to be trimmed back, and others have completely exhausted themselves. It's time to pull them out to make room for new seeds to be sown. One of the first things that I noticed when we got back was my bush beans were taken over by spider mites. Spider mites love dry, hot weather, and that's exactly what we've had. They basically suck the life out of your plants. Before we left, I noticed this was starting to happen, and I could have treated it, but I've already gotten several harvests out of these bush beans and preserved a lot, so I knew they were pretty much at their end. Right now, I have about 75 days until our first frost. That gives me enough time to do another succession of beans in the same place and be able to get 2 or 3 harvests before we have our first frost. The nice thing about planting bush beans this time of year when the temperatures are really warm is they pop right up out of that ground in a matter of a few days as long as you keep that soil moist. If you live in a place that has less than 75 days before your first fall frost, then you probably don't want to plant a warm season crop like bush beans, but rather plant a cool season crop in the place of those bush beans. When you're planting a warm season crop in the fall, you want to find the maturity date and add 2 weeks to that. That's because in the fall time, our days are starting to get cooler and shorter, unlike spring when our days are starting to get warmer and longer. If any of you have seen our summer garden videos, then you know how big our fennel gets here. It can reach easily up to 9 feet. In our Zone 8, it's a perennial with a deep root system, and it naturally starts to decline over the summertime and it has to be cut back. But the nice thing is after it's cut back, it grows back within 2 weeks. I also like to harvest the seed off of the fennel before I cut it back. I'll save that seed for cooking over the winter time, and the seed is also great used for tummy aches. In some areas, especially hot climates in the early fall, tomatoes will naturally start to look shabby, especially on the lower leaves and the undergrowth. Now you can go in here and remove these if you have the time, but I usually don't worry about it in the fall and just let it go. Determinate tomatoes will grow to a certain height and then quit growing, and those are the type that produce all of their tomatoes pretty much all at once. And at this point, they may have totally exhausted themselves and petered out, and they may need to be pulled out, making room for a new crop. Indeterminate tomatoes will continue to produce until we have our first frost. During August and September, you can start to trim the tops of your tomatoes if you don't have any green tomatoes up there. By trimming the tops now, that'll push the energy down into your green tomatoes, causing them to ripen before that first frost. When I look at my warm season crops this time of year, I need to look at their production. If those plants are there taking up space and using water without production, then out they need to go so that I can put something new in their space that's productive for the kitchen. Okra is a warm season crop that will continue to produce until we have our first frost. A couple of tidbits about okra is it loves the heat, and it can tolerate drier conditions than most of our other vegetable crops, making it perfect for dry, hot climates. You do need to pick okra on a daily basis because it does grow so quickly, especially in those warm climates. I like okra when it's about 2 inches. When it starts getting into 3 and 4 inches, it might be okay, but the 4 inches and up, it starts to get really woody and it isn't very good tasting. When you pick okra when it's really young, like about 1 inch, it's excellent and hardly even slimy, in my opinion, when you eat it raw. Okra's great pickled. It can be blanched and frozen. And it's also a great snack when seasoned with some salt and other spices and freeze-dried. Melons are finally starting to size up, and so this is when I need to be careful with my watering. When they're getting close to being ripe and I overwater, this can cause them to crack, and this is especially true for watermelon. And by overwatering or giving them too much water in the very end, this also washes out their flavor, making them more watery tasting. I like to mulch my melon plants at this stage. This not only helps keep the moisture in the soil, but it also helps control moisture fluctuations. In return, helping the melons not to crack, as well as keep their flavor. I have 8 different melon varieties, and some of them are new to me this year, thanks to a viewer and a friend that sent me seeds last year. Thanks, Rosemary. Cucumbers are another warm season crop that might start to peter out early fall, or may even be hit by diseases. Hopefully you've gotten a good harvest all summer long. But if they have been hit by diseases or they petered out, you may need to be brave and rip those out to make room for some new fall crops. This cucumber tower has done really well for me this summer. It's produced a lot of fruit, and now it's starting to slow up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and give it one more feeding of fish powder fertilizer just to boost it. If it doesn't start to change within about 10 days, then I'm going to go ahead and rip this plant out because I don't want it taking up space if it's not going to produce. And a good crop to follow this is green onions. Every year I like to try several new varieties in the garden because you never know when you're going to find a new favorite. This year I'm trying green frog fingers. With a name like that, I just had to try it because it cracks me up. They're extremely productive and they can be skewered whole and grilled. Eggplant produces very well here in our heat, and it'll continue to produce until we have our first fall frost. If I don't see any fruit that's being set by mid-September, then I'll go ahead and pull that plant out. That way I can put something in its place that'll produce. Lettuce is a great fall crop growing into winter and in some places through winter with some frost blanket. However, when temperatures are still above 90 degrees, it's hard to get lettuce to germinate, if at all. And transplants, they really don't like it. If you had a cooler spot in your garden like a shade tunnel, then you can probably plant those transplants just a little bit earlier. Then when the weather starts to get cooler, you can convert that shade tunnel into a poly high tunnel, extending that growing season into those cold months. A little note on polytunnels. They can still freeze unless you heat them. And you also have to make sure that you secure it really well and you don't have any of those cold drafts that can come into that polytunnel, causing things to freeze. And at that point, it's basically a greenhouse. I choose to just grow cool season crops in my polytunnel during the winter months. That way I don't have to worry about those warm season crops freezing in those winter months as well. Broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, lettuces, and mustard greens are excellent to grow in the high tunnels, and that's fresh food all winter long. Low tunnels and cold frames will basically give you the same results, allowing you to grow down to temperatures around 20 degrees. It's hard to think about freezing temperatures coming, but they are. Sowing carrot seeds in mid-August can be a bit of a gamble, unless you're growing under low tunnels, high tunnels, and cold frames. They really should be sown in mid-July. But sometimes you can get away with it if you have a late and warm fall. If you have the space and the time, you might want to give it a try because sometimes it does work. Just pick a shorter day to maturity type carrot. Carrots are always sweeter after they've had a frost, and in many places they can be stored right in the ground through the winter months. After the first frost, they should be mulched. You can use either dry grass clippings, straw, or something else that you like to use. If you do store your carrots in the ground for the winter months, then just make sure that you get them used up before spring when they start growing again. Otherwise, they become quite woody. Beets can also be sown in mid-August in our Zone 8 climate. Last year, I picked up a bunch of different seeds in Cortez, Colorado from Vibrant Earth Seeds. These seeds are adapted to growing in drier climates and more harsh environments like ours here. I grew several different varieties of beets, and one of them was the German Lutz beet. This one's a great winter keeper, and I'll be planting that one this week. Beets can tolerate a frost, but if you're expecting a hard freeze, then they need to be mulched or even pulled out if they're not grown under a high tunnel, cold frame, or low tunnel. Some other seeds that I'm really happy with from Vibrant Earth Seeds were the dry beans. I grew them last year and they did excellent, so I grew them again this year. These seeds only require watering once a week, which is huge in a dry climate that's been in a drought, and they still performed excellent. Finding the right seed for your climate can really help you have a successful, productive garden. I really love their seeds so much that we actually decided to carry them in our farm store. But if you're not local, then I'll put a link in the description of where you can buy them directly from this company. Other seeds that I'm going to be sowing this week are mustards, mustard spinach, Chinese cabbage, and pak choi. If you live in a climate that's not as hot as ours, then you can start sowing seeds of turnips and radishes. We're still in the 100 degrees. I won't be sowing any seeds of radish, turnips, lettuce, or spinach seeds until mid-September when our temperatures are consistently below 90 degrees. Even if you're in a zone 8 like we are here in southern Utah, you may not be as hot. USDA zones are for cold hardiness, and they don't take in consideration of hot temperatures. So you may have to adjust your dates for planting for your area. And if it's cooler, it's probably going to be planting sooner. If you aren't sure what zone you're in, then I'll put a link in the description to a chart to help you get that figured out. And in that link, you might want to explore their website. It's Bloom Gardens, and they have a lot of great gardening tips and helps. Plus, they have a great magazine. Tying and trimming up plants to keep the jungle under control and be able to walk down my narrow rows has to happen on a weekly basis. Tomatoes and tomatillos get pretty big this time of year and want to sprawl everywhere. By just simply tying them back to their cages will help keep the garden tidy. While we were gone, the holy basil went to seed, which it does rather quickly anyways. By giving it a nice haircut, then it'll push out a bunch of new foliage, which makes a nice tea for the anxious gardeners like me. If you've got some dry seed like this one right here, then you can go ahead and save that for planting next year. And whatever you trim off, you can actually toss to the chickens or the goats, and they'll appreciate it. Or you can save it and dry it for winter use, all parts. Chives start to get thin leaves and become floppy in our hot summers here, so I like to give mine a haircut all the way back to the ground. Within 24 hours of cutting my chives back, they grew 1 inch. And within 1 week, they grew almost an entire foot. That's how fast chives grow back. And their leaves are much thicker and more robust. My vegetable garden has very narrow rows, and things like summer squash and bush beans likes to creep in those rows, making it hard to walk down the pathway. I can use some small bamboo sticks and create a simple crisscross pattern to hold those plants inside the raised beds, making the garden not so wild. Late summer planting of transplants can be tricky when your temperatures are still above 100 degrees. Don't get tempted to plant them out in full sun without covering them, and make sure that you keep them well watered. When those temperatures are high, those young transplants are going to do a lot better under a floating row cover or a shade tunnel. Or, better yet, wait till temperatures cool off a little bit to avoid that frustration of losing your young transplants and that wasted time. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Be sure to like and share this video as well. Thanks for sharing your time with me today. And God bless you, and we'll see you next time. Green frog fingers. Zipper, that shade, my mouth was in and out. So I wasn't really concerned. Okay. And I don't know what to say next.
Well, how about
thick and robust? Then what? Green and a freaking stupid mouth, just doing them pretty normal. And for the kitchen